And I'm going to share my screen. Today we're going to talk about two really important topics, and we really like to kind of introduce these two pretty early in our training series. We're going to talk about disbursal methods and the stop pay policy. So if you come to my trainings, you're going to see a couple of these slides every single week. We keep everybody's microphones silent throughout the whole training because we do record this session, and we do care about your questions. We're going to ask you to use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to ask for clarifications or to pose questions to us. And we're going to stop several times throughout the training, and we'll tee up those questions and hopefully answer them for you. As I said, we are recording it, and that's why we keep you muted, because we also send you a follow-up email. We've sent it to everybody who's on our contact list. That email will include the link to the recording of this training. It'll also include the PDF of the PowerPoint that we use, as well as like a summary of key information or things that prompted a lot of questions. So everybody on our contact list will receive that. And if you if the invitation has been forwarded to you, or if you have other folks at your agency that you would like to get invited to these trainings, please use this cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address to provide us the staff member's name, their role in your grant, and to give us their email address. And we'll add them to the invitation list for the rest of the series, and they'll start to receive the follow-up emails as well. Hopefully starting next week, we'll start to post these recordings on the R3 website as well. But I'll let you know as soon as that goes live. We're still working on some of the details of that. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the stop pay policy. We're going to talk about the fiscal reporting requirements, and then review the 3 dispersal methods. So the stop pay policy is one of the features of the GATA system, right? So it's a statewide system that helps to enforce the uniform compliance with all of the GATA rules and regulations. And it's a live system, so it changes every day as agencies come on and off the stop pay list. It's something that the agencies can see in the GATA portal. There are actually 2 levels of stop pay, and that's based on the severity of the infraction of the issue that is placing an agency on the stop pay list. The temporary stop payment status or the permanent stop pay status. So the difference between the temporary and the permanent is the severity of the issue that has been raised, that is turning off the funding for that agency. So I'll give you a couple of examples of the type of issue that could place you on the temporary stop payment list. These issues are ones that can be remediated, they can be addressed. Whereas issues that would place an agency on the permanent stop pay list are much more severe, much more serious infractions. So the temporary stop payment would be things like failure to provide your required fiscal, programmatic, performance, or audit reports within 15 days of the due date. I think a lot of people think the stop pay is only for financial issues. If you have a significantly delinquent fiscal report, for instance, or a series of fiscal reports, but it's also for your performance report as well. That's equally as an important requirement, is that you submit all of these kinds of documentation when it's requested by the agency. And we do give you this 15-day window. We don't want to say you're using that all the time, but if that's becoming a significant issue, you may be placed on the temporary stop payment list. Similarly, your failure to submit a required refund payment or a missed payment from an approved payment plan would also put you on the temporary stop pay list. And I also want to emphasize, when you're on this stop pay list, it's not just turning off the funding from the authority. It's turning off the funding from all of the state agencies that you may work with that that work under GATA. So stop payment is the system-wide suspension of funding to your agency. Here are some other issues: the failure to clear fiscal or administrative monitoring issues. If we've come out and done a site visit and we've identified some issues that we're going to, that will force us to implement a corrective action plan, any failure to address those issues in the corrective action plan could be another reason you'd be placed on the temporary stop payment list until those issues are cleared up. Failure to respond to an audit report or an on-site review correction for deficiencies and material weaknesses, and including any payment of question costs. We talked a little bit yesterday about the financial documentation that you're required to maintain for the length of your grant, actually for 3 years after your grant closes. And that we do review that documentation periodically throughout your grant. When we're coming out to do a site visit, typically within the first year, we may also do a review of your financial documentation. We're going to ask you to PDF that and to send it to us so that we can make sure that you didn't incur any costs that were outside of that approved budget. So if there are any question costs and you're not addressing that and not paying those funds back, that could be another reason to be placed on the temporary stop payment list. And finally, we also have this other category for fact-based discretionary issues documented by the authority. As I said, the difference between the temporary and the permanent stop payment list is the severity of the issue. And temporary stop payment issues are those that can be addressed. But the ones that may place you on the permanent stop payment list are issues so severe that they can't be remediated. So here's a list of some of the significant issues that would get you to the permanent stop pay list. Any offense indicating the lack of business integrity or honesty that seriously and directly affects the grantee's present responsibility, violation of the grant terms or a transaction so serious as to affect the integrity of the program. Other issues that are so serious or compelling that affects the present responsibilities for the grant. And of course, fraud that would be documented by the Office of the Executive Inspector General or any other government entity's investigation. So you can see the difference between those issues that can be addressed and get you back into a good status and enable us to start dispersing funds again, versus these very serious infractions that would turn off the funding permanently from the state agencies that under GATA. If your fiscal or performance report is delinquent 30 or more calendar days from the due date without an approved written explanation, you will be placed on the stop payment list. So we do want you to stay in a good status. So it really is important when you receive the the list of due dates for both your performance reports and your fiscal reports. It's really important that you, if you're having trouble completing any of those reports, that you stay in really good communication with your grant specialist, and they may be able to help solve whatever issue that is, so that we don't have to put you on the stop payment list because of this delinquency. So I think I said in our first training, the overview training of like the whole process for the grant, that we really do emphasize that your grant specialist is your partner in this grant. So it's our job to kind of to keep you within all of these rules and regulations, within those guardrails, So work with us and be our partner and tell us when things are going on, and then we won't have to place you on the stop pay list. So if there is an issue and we do have to place you on the stop payment list, your grant specialist will send you a letter to that effect. They'll identify the deficiency, the issue that is triggering the stop payment. They'll provide you the instructions of how to correct that deficiency. And again, we're going to give you that due date by which you have to address that issue. But if you don't pay attention to that due date and the issue isn't corrected by that deadline, you're going to get a second notice that's going to tell you that you have been placed on that that stop payment list, and that we've placed that in the GATA portal, so no agency that uses the portal can send you funds. So placement on the stop payment list will make you ineligible to receive funds from the authority and all other state agencies who use the GATA system until their compliance has been met. So for some of you, that may be a really significant issue, turning off all the state funding. So we want to tell you all of this information up front to avoid you being placed on that list. But two important points: your grant specialist will continue to work with you to to help you address those deficiencies and to keep you on track so we can take you off the list. And even if you are on the stop payment list, you're still contractually obligated to continue program activity while we address this deficiency until you're brought back into compliance. So once you do get back in our good graces and you've addressed the issue, you've complied with all of the issues that need to be addressed, you will be removed from the stop payment list. So that will enable all the state agencies that may be your funders to release funds to you. And you will receive the written confirmation from your grant specialist that you've been removed from the stop payment list. So I'll stop here to see if there are any questions in the chat. Aisha or Megan?
I'm not seeing any questions.
No, great. Then we'll talk about fiscal reporting requirements. So this is really important. By paying attention to these reporting requirements, we'll keep you off the stop payment list. So once your agreement has been signed by the authority's executive director, your grant specialist will send you the PFR that's been created for your grant. Now, the reason that we can't send it to you yet is because it is specially crafted for your grant, and it includes the final approved budget, and it's not the final approved budget until our director signs that agreement. And it also is set up for the disbursal method that will be used for your grant. And in a few minutes, we're going to go through those different disbursal methods. So this is another issue that you'll be communicating with your grant specialist as we move through the execution process, that you'll be discussing the disbursal method with them so that they'll know what system you're going to be using and they can set up your PFR for that particular dispersal method using your final approved budget. We're going to talk about the PPR, which is the periodic performance report, in a couple of weeks. That will not come directly from, that's going to take a little bit longer because we work in partnership with our research team who actually set up that PPR, but that too is specially developed to match the goals, objectives, and performance in your final agreement. So you will receive that through your specialist as well. It just won't come in this initial letter with your PFR. But this initial communication with your grant specialist after the execution of your agreement will also include the reporting schedule. So it'll have all the due dates for your PPR and your PFR, the performance reporting and the financial reporting. And as you'll see in a second, PFRs are always, and PPRs as well, are always due 15 days after the end of the period that's being reported. So if you're using a monthly reporting for your PFR, this would be your reporting schedule. And this will all be detailed in the letter that you receive from your grant specialist, along with the executed copy of your agreement. You'll see it's 15 days after the end of the period of performance. And if the 15th falls on a Saturday or Sunday, they'll make adjustments in those letters. Now, our PPRs, the performance reports, are always due on the calendar quarter. So for your PPR, it'll be 15 days after the end of that calendar quarter. So we're going to start our grants in November. So you'll actually have 5 of these quarterly reports because we always stay on the calendar quarter. So the first PPR, the performance report, will be due in January. And then you'll have a 5th quarterly report that will just report your performance in October, and that will be due November 15th of next year. Now, if you elect to use a reimbursement and a quarterly financial reporting schedule, then these would be the same dates that you will use for your quarterly reporting. It's always on the calendar quarter. So before we dive into the dispersal methods, are there any questions, Meg?
Not seeing any.
Great. All right, now the dispersal methods. So before we go into the dispersal methods, I want to give you a definition of what a cash budget is. You'll see as we discuss the different methods that we talk about whether a cash budget is needed for that dispersal method. And a cash budget, and it's actually one of the tabs that you'll be completing in your PFR, the periodic financial report. It's just your way. It's a way of like planning out what your expected dispersals are by budget category across each month of your period of performance. So I'll show you an example in a few minutes of what a cash budget looks like. And next week on the 10th, we'll actually introduce you to the PFR, and you'll see how the dispersal method really does affect how we craft your PFR. So that's what a cash budget is. So there are 3 dispersal methods under R3. I'll just note that a number of our funds are restricted, like our federal funds are generally restricted to reimbursement only. But for R3, there are 3 possible dispersal methods: reimbursement, advance pay, and the working capital advance. So reimbursement is by far the simplest method to elect. There's no advance dispersal. You're just going to be paying out your grant expenses month by month or quarter by quarter. Some agencies do elect a quarterly reimbursement schedule. So you're going to pay out your grant expenses, and then you're going to submit your PFR, the periodic financial report. That's going to indicate the expenses that were incurred under the grant by budget category. And we will reimburse you for those costs. So that's the simplest method by far. Now, there's no submission of backup documentation required for this method. But you do have to maintain all that good backup documentation for all of your expenses that we discussed in yesterday's training. And if you weren't on yesterday's training and you need to get that follow-up email with the recording and all that good detail, if you would just use the cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address, and we'll get you that information. So for the reimbursement method, we don't require you to fill out a cash budget, but it can be a helpful tool for you to kind of project your cash needs, because you're going to have to come up with the cash to pay out those expenses before you request reimbursement. So while it's not required for our purposes, it can be a good tool to help you plan out your expenses and keep track of your actual expenses relative to what you anticipated. The second method is advance pay. This is a little more complicated, but it allows for an initial cash dispersal of your first month's projected expenses. So you will need a cash budget for that because it's going to you're going to be developing the projections on a month-by-month basis. After we make this initial cash dispersal for your first month's projected expenses, all your subsequent dispersals will advance the next month's projected expenses. The way that the 2 CFR, the federal financial guidelines language reads is that we can advance you your immediate cash needs. We define that as 30 days worth of projected expenses, so that next month's projected expenses. And then again, of course, your dispersal is made based on the PFR that you submit. As I said, a cash budget is required. And the PFR reports the grant expenses that are paid. And there's also a column on the advance pay PFR where you're going to project what your expenses are, budget category by budget category for that upcoming month, for that next month. And so the dispersal is going to be based on your any cash you have on hand versus the projected your projected expenses for the next month. Let me go back one. So basically, let me give you a good example. If you projected that you're going to spend $1,000 in your first month, and then we get your first PFR that reports that you only expended $800, but you expect to spend $1,000 in month 2, we're only going to send you $800 because you already have $200 cash on hand, and $1,000 you expect to spend, we're going to subtract that cash balance so that you have exactly what you project that you're going to need for that next month. Another example is if you projected, if your first month's expected expenses are $1,000, but you actually ended up spending $1,100 on approved budget items, and you project another $1,000 the next month. Now we're going to send you $1,100 because you're $100 in the hole after month 1, and you still need $1,000 for month 2. So we're going to send you $1,100. So we look at what your projected expenses are for the coming month, and then we factor in any cash balance that you have on hand after that first dispersal or after the previous dispersal. Now, advance pay is not available to everyone. It requires an assessment to determine your eligibility. Now, that assessment is conducted by a financial consulting firm that the state contracts with. And so if you think that advance pay might be something that you're interested in, then maybe the dispersal method that would work for you, then this is another point of communication with your grant specialist so that they can get your contact information over to the consultants and they can start doing this assessment. Basically, what they're looking for is that you have the administrative capacity to be able to segregate those advance funds, to properly account for those grant funds that are coming from this grant, that you have that structure in place and that you can properly segregate those funds from all the other funds that you may have in your agency, and that you won't be using these advance funds for non-grant expenses. So to do that, this is as I said, this is like the language that allows us to do the advance pay. But what that assessment will entail is all of these points. That consultant would reach out to your agency and ask you for your chart of accounts. They're going to review, examine, and test sample financial reports. They're going to look at your internal control procedures, guiding your fund transactions, authorization controls, recording controls, and segregation of duties. They're going to review your procedures related to advance pay. They're going to review your documentation demonstrating training and awareness related to fraud and ethics. And then finally, review and examine your grant budget. So once the consultant does this review, based on the documents that you're going to send to them, they'll let us know whether or not they think that you have the sufficient administrative capacity to qualify for advance pay. And then if that's approved, then your grant specialist will set up your PFR for the advance pay method. But particularly for the advance pay, timeliness and accuracy of your PFR reporting is really, really important. Because if we're giving you the funds for just the next 30 days of grant activity, we want to make sure that you're getting your PFR in a timely fashion so that we can review and approve it and that the dispersal can happen. So you'll have that money in time for when you're incurring those expenses. So for advance pay, you can see that monthly reporting is required. And this is the method that is most important to give you that money in time for you to use it. Advanced timeliness and accuracy of your reporting is important. If we find that there are errors or there are questions on your PFRs, then your grant specialist is going to come back to you and ask for clarifications or corrections. That's going to add days to the dispersal process. And so we really want you to pay attention to that, particularly if you're using advance pay. Megan, let's stop and see if there are any questions so far before we dive into working capital.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. The first question is, can we use a combination of the advance and reimbursement method?
No,
Easy enough.
because the PFR is set up for one or the other.
The next question is, to clarify what is needed in the reimbursement process, we are submitting solely the PFR, but not submitting items such as effort tracking, timesheets, and the payroll verification if we are utilizing employee salaries. Just have them stored and ready to produce if requested.
No, there will be, and we'll go into this in a later training, but we will be doing a training, I think, in 2 weeks on time reporting, time and effort reporting. And there are time records that are not the actual timesheets, but either a time certification for staff that are charged at 100% of their time to the grant, or what we call the personal activity report. If you have a staff member that is funded 50, like I'm funded 50% out of R3 and 50% out of another fund, then I keep track of that time and I have, and I submit that to my supervisor. Those certifications, those time records, not the actual time sheet, but that personal activity report does need to come with the PFR. The other documentation of, the receipts for the office supplies that you charge to the grant, that kind of financial documentation isn't required to be submitted, but the time and effort is, and we'll go into that in a couple of weeks. But that was a good question. Thank you.
Um, so advance payment is allowed? Yes.
Yes, if you qualify for it, it is allowed.
Yes. And then the next question is, once an organization is denied advance pay, are they able to qualify later, of course, after building capacity in the deficient areas in the grant period?
It's difficult to do. We would love to see that you increase your capacity. It's possible. It's difficult because we have to kind of restructure your PFR. So we would have to go back and like recreate it for you because there's no way to kind of turn things on and off midstream in the PFR the way it's structured. But it's possible. It just takes more work of sort of recreating all the PFRs. So it's possible. I also note for advance pay that if you have other grants with the authority, if you had a previous grant, even if it's closed, and you qualified for advance pay, you won't have to go through the same review again. But you should let your grant your grant specialists know that you're interested in advance pay, and they'll get that information over to our fiscal office, and they can just double check that you are qualified for it and that there were no issues that were raised when, in your audit or anything like that, that might have us do that review again, or that would disqualify you for advance pay.
And last question, when will we elect the dispersal method?
Um, the sooner if you're interested in advance pay or working capital advance, the sooner you let your grant specialist know that you're interested in that, so we can get this assessment done, and hopefully it's completed by the time you have a signed agreement, and so we can, be able to send you that PFR right away. Working capital advance, I'll talk about that right, just now, but there's also some steps regarding working capital advance. So like the sooner that you make that decision, or at least let us know which of these you think you qualify for and that would work best for this grant, the better it would be, because then we can your grant specialist can start to structure things for you. Is that the last one?
That's the last. Oh, one more just came through.
Okay.
What if you administered advance pay issues with another state agency successfully? Would that count?
We'll let your grant specialist know, and we'll check with our fiscal office, and they'll probably reach out to that other agency just to make sure that that there were no issues, and so you won't have to go through that assessment process again.
And that's it.
Okay. Well, then let's dive into working capital advance. I'll also mention that because working capital advance is the most complicated, well, yes, I guess complicated, of 3 dispersal methods, that we're going to do our next Wednesday session is just going to be about working capital advance. So, if you have as you start to this coming week, as you start to think about how that might work for you, be sure to come to next Wednesday's session. We're really going to go through some examples and really kind of walk through the nitty gritty of working capital advance. It's proven to be a really valuable method for a lot of our grantees, particularly our grantees that are smaller or are just getting started. It's been an important opportunity for them. So while it is a little more involved, for a lot of our agencies, it's worth it. So under working capital advance, it allows for an initial dispersal of projected expenses for a period not to exceed 2 months of your ongoing operation expenses and any startup costs. So it gives you a chunk of, oops, I went the wrong way. It gives you an initial dispersal that's pretty significant. It gives you all of the, the funds to, to buy the laptops and the desks and chairs for your new staff that you're going to be hiring for this program. The sports equipment, if you've got, a recreational program, all of those things that you need to start your program, and those should be detailed again in your cash budget. And we should be seeing that as a recognized startup cost. And it also gives you this reserve fund of 2 months worth of operating expenses. So that's that initial dispersal. As I said, this method is really important to have a really solid cash budget where you're going to plan out your expected expenditures on a month-by-month basis by each budget category. And I'll show you the cash budget in a little while. Your subsequent dispersals are going to basically reimburse you for the actual expenses you're reporting each month. And so, of course, we have to have monthly reporting for this, because by reimbursing you for those ongoing expenses each month, what you're reporting as your expenses, you're kind of replenishing that 2-month operating fund that you're going to carry through the length of the grant. If you had a grant a couple of years ago with the authority, when we were first getting started with working capital advance, We used to require that our grantees sent all their backup documentation, all those receipts, all the timesheets, every invoice, everything had to come to the authority with your PFR every single month to support your documented expenses. We've revised our policy and we no longer require that monthly backup documentation every month for working capital advance grantees. But in revising this policy, we instead are requiring that within the first 6 months of your grant, that your specialist will ask for a sample of that backup documentation. So if your grants get started in November, within the first 6 months, say in January, your specialist will reach out and will ask you to send a PDF of all of that backup documentation that we reviewed in yesterday's session. And they'll be making sure that that you have adequate documentation for all of those expenses for January that you've reported on your PFR. And I really want to emphasize this isn't meant to be like punitive. We're not trying to, set up another, hoop for you to jump through. But particularly for the working capital advance grantees, we really want to do this test kind of early on to make sure that you are keeping adequate documentation and that we don't find out, later on when we do a PFR review or we do a site visit or if you're audited and we find that you have unallowable expenses because we're going to need that money back because we can only, pay you for the things that were within your budget that were allowable expenses. So this is just a way of sort of giving us a chance to take a look and make sure that you've gotten your grant started on the right foot. And so sometime within the first 6 months, we'll do this sampling to make sure that all of your documentation is in order. So one of the things that makes working capital advance a little trickier is that your dispersals aren't always just going to be that monthly reimbursement to replenish your nest egg. We have two goals. First one is to make sure that that reserve is only the 2 months of operating expenses. And we realize that no matter how good a plan we come up with that cash budget, there's a lot of dynamic factors that might change that. You might have 2 of your 4 staff members leave and now you're sitting on too much cash. So we may reduce your dispersal that month if you're sitting on too much cash. But our second goal is to, during that last quarter of your period of performance, start spending down that reserve fund so that we can get you to as close to a zero cash balance as possible by the end of your grant. So you'll work very closely with your grant specialist that last quarter to spend down that reserve amount. So those dispersals will go down so we get you as close to zero as possible. Now, with the advance pay, you had to qualify for it. You had to go through this assessment to make sure that you were eligible for it. For working capital advance, grantees have to submit a certification that they lack the reserves to operate their program without that advance. So where you had to qualify for advance pay, for working capital advance, you have to say, I really can't, hire the staff, turn on the lights, buy that laptop, buy that desk, unless you give me those startup costs and I have this cash flow to make sure that I can meet payroll next month, that I can pay the rent, I can keep the lights on. So there's a certification that grantees will sign if they're interested in working capital advance to certify that they don't have those reserves, they don't have the cash flow to start the program and to operate the program without having this working capital advance. So that's all of our content so far today. We do appreciate when you use this funny address to complete our survey and to tell us how we're doing and to tell us what we can do better. I think I saw some questions pop up in the chat, Megan?
Yep. Two quick questions.
Mhm.
I'm trying to understand the difference between working capital advance and advance pay options.
Mhm.
Why would someone choose one over the other?
Well, for advance pay, first of all, you may not qualify for it if you don't, if that assessment doesn't doesn't demonstrate that you have that administrative capacity that this consultant will be looking to document, right? Um, the advance pay, you're just getting 1 month's worth of advance at a time. In working capital advance, it's different. We're not assessing your administrative capacity to set you up for working capital advance. You're telling us that you can't turn the lights on. You can't make the program start unless we give you this advance so that you can start the program and that you don't have the cash flow to be able to operate the program unless you have this reserve funding so that you can meet payroll next month. So they're really kind of designed for different agencies, really, because advance pay, you have to have like a pretty established administrative capacity for that we're going to document with this assessment. And you just want next month's money so you keep that regular cash flow. The working capital advance grantees tend to be smaller, newer agencies that don't have that cash flow. They wouldn't make payroll unless they get this dispersal from us and have that operating fund. So my experience is really they suit different agencies with different administrative capacity, different funding streams, basically. Um, I hope that answered the question.
Yes, she says thank you.
Oh, good.
The next question is, will the working capital advance be a one-time disbursement? Should there be an extension 1 or 2 years? Will there be another working capital disbursement?
So the working capital, we give you that initial dispersal, and then every single month you send in your PFR, your grant specialist will be evaluating your projected expenses based on your cash budget and the reserve funds that you have on hand, right? And they will be giving you a dispersal every month to maintain your 2 months worth of operating expenses. Um, and next Thursday, when we go through the actual PFR, we're going to demonstrate how the PFR is different for each of these dispersal methods. And you'll see that basically the PFR is a giant Excel file. And the reason we have to have that dispersal method when we set up your PFR is because there's an enormous macro in this file that turns certain features and formulas on and off based on the dispersal method. And so it will give us the calculated dispersal for working capital advance grantees based on the cash budget and their expenditures. So it does that calculation for us. So you will get ongoing dispersals. Regarding additional years of funding, it depends if we're going to start a brand new agreement next year for year 2, or we have sometimes amended the year 1 agreement. And so if we're amending the year 1 agreement, we won't do that last quarter spend down of your reserve because we won't do that until the end of year 2. So the goal is to, eventually for you to not need that working capital advance, you're going to build your administrative capacity, and you will be better positioned to maybe to transition in future grants to an advance pay or to just reimbursement. But for those agencies that don't have the reserves, they don't have the cash flow, they would be, you can stay on working capital advance. And if there's a year 3 agreement and you're still a working capital advance grantee, then there would be, that same initial dispersal of the 2 months of operating funds. by that point, we wouldn't expect there to be any startup costs that are necessary. So we'll just be reestablishing that 2 month of reserve funding for you. What else you got, Megan?
For reimbursement, is submission of backup documentation required for dispersal?
It is not.
Okay. If we're receiving reimbursement from ICEJA already, will we have to re-register with the controller for reimbursement with the grant? Sorry, for direct deposit.
No. So if you've set up direct deposit with the comptroller's office, you're set.
Right.
And that goes for all three of the dispersal methods.
And then the last question so far. If the working capital advance is selected, how soon are funds dispersed from the time of the program start date?
So I forget which training we're going to do. I think we'll talk about this next week. So the way that it works is that when we have an executed agreement, we file that agreement with the comptroller's office because all the funding comes from the comptroller's office, right? And so when we first have an executed agreement, they basically, the way I think of it is they set up like a checking account for that grant for this state fiscal year. It's called a contract obligation document. And it can take a little while for that COD to be established, for them to open that checking account for this particular grant. And so that's the first thing we do when we have a signed agreement. And then any dispersals that are based on your PFR come out of that specific checking account. So that first dispersal can take a little bit longer because it's a two-step process then, because it's establishing the checking account and then writing a check from it, basically. After that COD is established, the checks will just come, or the direct deposits will come from the comptroller's office just based on the PFRs. And again, the more timely you are and the more accurate you are with submitting your PFRs for all three of the dispersal methods, the more timely the dispersals from the comptroller's office. Internally, what we do when we receive your PFR, I'll just tell you, the grant specialist is going to review it to make sure it makes sense, that it seems to be accurate. We enter those numbers into our grants management system. And if everything seems to add up correctly, we approve the dispersal. The grant specialist sends that over to their supervisor for review and approval. If they approve it, then it goes over to our fiscal department and they go into the comptroller system to initiate the dispersal. So that process can take about 2 weeks even if with direct deposit, which by the way, we encourage you to do, you'll get the checks even faster. But we'll talk about that next week when we go through the detail on the PFRs and introduce you to the actual form. And actually, I think I wanted to bring up the cash budget just to give you, so let me take that down for a second. I apologize for neglecting to bring that up for you. Let me go real quickly over there. Sorry, I gotta put my glasses on. Oops. I am not seeing it now. I apologize. There it is. There you go. So here's a little sneak peek at the PFR. As I said, it's a giant Excel sheet. And I don't know how well this is gonna, you can see it, how well you can see it, all these little numbers. But basically, here's all of the budget categories. This is your approved budget, so that'll already be in there. And then you're just going to take your expenses and you're going to plot them out how you anticipate you'll be incurring these costs throughout the life of the grant. In this example, you will see that we have basically ongoing expenses for the personnel and fringe benefits for the 4 staff members that you're going to hire. You're projecting your travel is going to be only $50 a month, the local reimbursement for the first months, and then it's going to pick up. So again, there'll be adjustments. This cash budget is important because it shows you how you anticipate changes in your expenditures every month. So you're expecting that that local travel is going to pick up once the program gets established. You'll see that we have your supplies. This is those startup costs, right? We're going to buy those desks and those laptops that you need for your program. But then after that, it'll probably go down a little bit. And then you think ongoing expenses are only about $350 a month. Your contractual services, we're going to have a subaward in my example. And basically, if you were in yesterday's training and got the follow-up, I sent you a sample budget. This is the working capital advance that I beg your pardon, the cash budget that I used from that example. So in that example, we think that we're going to have a subaward that's going to be about $10,000 a month, but we don't think that's going to start up until month 3. So again, we see that there may be fluctuations in your expenditures over the course of the agreement. Your lease is going to be $2,000 a month. That's a pretty standard expense. Same thing with your telecommunications. You want to have phones and internet. But we're also going to do 2 trainings, but they're going to take place in months 3 and 4. So by plotting all of this out in the cash budget, the PFR macro will take all of this anticipated expenses into account and come up with your initial, we'll come up with the recommended dispersals. So you can see down here, I set this up for working capital advance. I hope you can see it. And so it's calculating that your initial dispersal will be $60,268. Where'd they get that number? This first month's expenses, which include those startup costs, and then another month and a month's operating expenses, and your second month's projected expenses, which is like now here's the second month of operating expenses. So they're going to give you that big initial dispersal. Subsequent dispersals will be looking back at that cash balance to see, I beg your pardon, that cash budget to see what expenses are anticipated, what you think you're going to need to operate the program month to month. And we'll be making those calculations. Now you'll also see that we have a place where we can make adjustments. And again, here's the communication with your grant specialist and why this is really important. You know that you have projected that you need that $1,000 for the trainer in month 3. Well, now the training isn't going to happen until later on. Well, we'll adjust then the dispersal, the cash that you need in that reserve. We're going to defer that a little bit. Maybe you on the subaward, you didn't think you'd have it all set up until the 3rd month. Maybe things fell into place really quickly, and now you need to change that. You're going to have that subaward finalized, and their activity is going to start in the 2nd month. We need to communicate that with your grant specialist so they can make an adjustment to make sure that you have that 2 months worth of operating reserve all the way through the grant. So you have that little nest egg. But we know that budgets are plans, and there are a lot of dynamic factors that may affect the accuracy of that plan as we go through the period of performance. So that's why the communication with your grant specialist is really key, so that they understand why there might be changes and as we go through the life of the grant, and keep them informed. And in return, they're going to keep you informed why they're not sending you that whole dispersal that you thought you were going to receive, because they looked at this and they say, oh, nope, your cash reserve is getting too big now because your anticipated startup costs were actually less than you budgeted. Now you're sitting on too much money. So that's why the cash budget is really important. particularly for the working capital advance, because the PFR is going to calculate your dispersal every month. And maybe you have a really simple grant and you're paying for the 2 staff members, fringe and salary, and it's going to march along really clean and simply. That would be great. Very few grants actually are that simple. And so because there are all these dynamic factors that, you know, neither of us have anticipated as we go through the period of performance. So let's see what else I can send. Do we have any other questions, Meg?
One last question. Does ICEJA have specific guidelines, documentation requirements for projecting costs?
Well, you're going to have, when you're going to fill out your cash budget, you'll already have an approved budget, right? So you've worked through with your grant specialist, what you guys are doing right now. You're working through your actual line item budget. And so now that you've done that exercise and we've come to agreement on what your budget is going to be, you're going to take that and just kind of plot out what you expect every month. So I need Megan's salary and Megan's fringe benefits every month along the way. I don't need that training until month 4. So I'm going to put that on month 4 on the training and education line. And that's really basically how you're going to do it. Take that approved budget and plot it out when you're going to need those each of those expenses. I hope that helps. Any other questions?
That's the last question.
Great. Then we'll actually finish up right on time. Next Wednesday, we're going to dig down deeper into working capital advance. And then next Thursday, Sarah Anguiano is going to take you through completing the PFR, and she'll demonstrate all 3 of the dispersal methods. So that's it. Any last questions, or shall we call it a day?
I think we can call it a day.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and watch for your follow-up email later on. And if you have other folks that you'd like to see invited or to receive the contact information, please use the cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address, and we'll add them to the list. Thanks for your time.